On Wednesday, President Muhammadu Buhari formally launched the National Development Plan 2021 to 2025 with a targeted investment outlay of 348.1 trillion naira to achieve the goals set out in the 5-year plan. The new plan is a successor to the 5-year economic recovery and growth plan, which lapsed in 2020. But the question on many minds is how many of the targets set in the ERGP were achieved by the administration, and if the National Development Plan is going to make much of a difference. Now joining us to discuss the new 5-year development plan and tell us how government intends to go about its implementation after the ERGP failed to meet any of its objectives is Johnson Chukwu, founder and CEO of Cowry Asset Management Limited. Welcome to the show. Chief Chukwu. Hi, Chief Chukwu. Merry Christmas to you. Hi, Chief Chukwu. I understand that you are joining us from the village where there is a 4G, internet facility. The same village where some lawmakers in the National Assembly said there was no internet connection. You remember that, I'm sure, but that's not why you're here. That's some other matter. But very quickly, this National Development Plan, will it make a difference? How is it different from the Economic Recovery Growth Plan that expired in December 2020? And why did that ERGP, why did it fail? What is new this time around?
Okay, thank you, Dr. Chief Ruben Abate. And thank you, Junior Chief. All of you are Chief now, including Chukwu.
I like that. Chief Total.
So if Ruben is High Chief, you are the Junior Chief, and Tundu will be also a Chief. Okay, good morning and Happy Christmas in advance to all of you and to Nigerians.
Happy Christmas.
Interestingly, when I saw that the government came up with an economic development plan, I felt a sense of, one, deja vu, in the sense that it's a repetition of what we have seen in the recent past. You just mentioned the issue of economic growth and recovery plan. Prior to that, we had Vision 2020, we've had Vision 2010. We've not been short of economic plans. The challenge we've had is in the execution. You asked, what is the difference between the National Development Plan of 2021-2027 and the Economic Recovery and Growth Plan of 2017 to 2020? The major difference, and I wouldn't really say the major difference, one of the challenges we had with the Economic Recovery and Growth Plan was that it was high on vision or on ambition, but short on strategy. If you look at some of those parameters they mentioned in that plan, one of which is that we're going to have increased the power supply by 10 terabytes. We're going to create 15 million jobs within that period. And none of those things, there was no fundamental strategy on how those plans or those ambitions were to be achieved, which is the greatest shock. Some of us actually complained when that announcement was made of the plan. And we said that this plan is short on execution because there was no underlying fundamental economic reasoning that would drive the feel-good ambition that we are contained in that plan. Now we're talking of another plan. There's been a lot of changes in terms of orientation of the government. Two things I have to mention on the new plan is that prior to during the time of when ERGP was unfolded, the presidency's economic orientation was more of a statist approach. The government wanted to maintain ownership of the oil and gas sector. The government wanted to control virtually all arms of economic activity in the country. And the president's then orientation was that the government has to be involved in managing economic activities or engage in economic activities. There's been a shift from my own observation of the president's orientation. The president has approved and signed into law the Petroleum Industry Act. The president is now introducing private sector in managing road infrastructure. the president is pushing to have the airports concessioned to the private sector. That simply means that there is a realization that the government does not have the economic resources, the revenue profile to continue to build infrastructure that will catalyze this economy into a productive economy. So I think what will be the difference in the new plan is that it's going to be largely driven by the private sector. The second aspect of the plan is going to stretch beyond the current government. So it has to be a plan that a new government that will take over in 2023 will be ready to run with, will see as of creating value. I think that would be the major difference. We need to bring a private sector to at the commanding height of economic resource management in this country if we have to build infrastructure like they plan in that 2021-2027 National Development Plan.
How would you suggest that the private sector is included? Because, the new National Development Plan does create a huge role for the private sector. Most of the funding for that plan is to come from the private sector, over 80%. Is that actually feasible? And what are your thoughts on that generally?
It is feasible, but it's going to be depending on a number of factors. One of which is we must have the appropriate policy environment. We must have the appropriate legal environment. We must improve on security situation in the country. And we must develop the framework to bring in private sector into those sectors of the economy that we want them to bring 80% to fund. I just mentioned in passing the plan to bring in private sector in managing the airport infrastructure. What that means is that the private sector, once airports are concessioned to them, the government will come up with a defined minimum performance standards, defined infrastructure build that the private sector operator has to undertake, and the timeline for that. And there must be sanctions in the event that such concessionaires fail to meet the agreed deliverables. So, and the government must hold back. I mean, the law governing private sector investment into these sectors must be such that no government can just come and cancel any of these concessions without very punitive costs to the government of the nation. And the process of cancellation should go through the National Assembly. If you have a legal framework that makes it difficult for government to revoke concessions, unlike what we had in the past, then that would serve as a deterrent and will assure private sector investors that no new government will wake up because they woke up on the wrong side of the bed and then decide to annul existing concession where investment and capital has actually gone into. So if we have that, and I always use the telecommunications sector as a live example, as a proof of concept. If you recall, Tundu, we used to have a NITEL, and NITEL was the sole body responsible for providing telecommunication services in the country. Today, the government pulled back from that sector and allowed private sector to invest in it. The first set of auctioning of GSM licenses had 3 licenses that paid $285 million each. We auctioned the 5Gs, and they have to pay about $273 million each, to I think $273.6 million each, and there were 2 winners. So, and if you look at the level of investment that has gone into building telecommunication infrastructure in the country, it was largely driven private sector. Just imagine if the government was to fund that. Today, you wouldn't be in my village in Ugwe and be getting this interview wouldn't have taken place. But because private sector saw economic opportunities in setting up a mast here, they did that. But if it was a government that would have needed a connection to the presidency to get them to set up a nighttime mast here. But we have the infrastructure, government spent nothing, government that made money from the concessioning or the licensing of these spectrums. But beyond that, we've created so much employment from that sector. And ancillary employment in several other sectors of the economy where data services are critical to operate. So that can be replicated in several sectors of the economy: road infrastructure, rail infrastructure, aviation infrastructure, including our seaports can also be concession, and then that will allow private sector to build these seaports where we can actually have easy logistics supply in the country.
Why is the power sector different? Why is that private sector magic not working in the power sector?
I think we got it wrong with the process of concessioning or selling of those assets to the people who bought them. There are a couple of things, if we have to do a postmortem on that, the process of privatizing the power sector. Look at the company that acquired the discos, the distribution companies. Look at the company that acquired the Gencos. Look at the fact that the government has retained ownership of the transmission grid. And remember, the transmission grid is very critical. We've seen a lot of what they call, where you call a transmission grid collapse in the country because they couldn't wheel out power generated by the generation companies. But beyond that, the concessionaires or those who acquired the discos there was none that had strong economic, with all due respect to them, strong economic power to invest in those sectors. They acquired those discos from leverage from the banks, and the banks, because the government also did not do its own part, there was a plan to adopt a cost-inflative tariff, and there was a multi-year tariff order that was that was indexed to the exchange rate, indexed to inflation rates, that was to allow the discos charge economic reflective tariff. That never happened. So eventually what happened was the discos couldn't earn enough revenue from the sale of power as to pay for power purchase from the generated by the Gencos. So you had a economic failure of that privatization process, because if the final interface with the consumer cannot generate enough revenue from the consumption of the power that was sold to the consumers, so it becomes impossible to pay for power generated, to pay for transmission, even to pay, and if you don't pay for power generated, the power generators cannot pay for gas supply. And that's why that process has been living on a life support from the central bank, where the central bank has continued to give money to the discos so they can pay the Gencos. We need to review that process. It was a clear case of a process that failed ab initio. It does not necessarily mean that the private sector cannot run the power sector very well. But the concept is that if you do something that it failed, you review it and redo it and do it properly. And there are a couple of suggestions I made in the past on how the government can improve the framework for the entire value chain in the power sector, so that we can make it economically viable and sustainable. That's the only way new investment can come there. As it stands today, the banks cannot lend further to the discos. And as long as the banks can lend further to the discos, they can improve their aggregate collection and losses. That is the aggregate technical and collection losses. Because if they can't invest further on their distribution grid, they can't improve on the losses. And if they can't improve on the losses, the charge-out rate will include to the consumers will include leakages and wastages, which makes the tariff not sustainable.
Okay, Chief, look, the Minister of Finance, he says there are 6 clusters in this proposed development plan. I would have loved you to talk about those 6 clusters and then where the money to fund it will come from. But I think there's one foundational issue that we need to address. Nigeria has always been talking about development plans since 1962, yes, under Balewa, when we had the 1962 to 68 first development national plan. When Gowon took over, we had the, his own 1968 to whatever development plan, second national development plan. We had under Murtala Muhammad at some point, 1975 to 80 development plan. We had the 4th development plan under Obasanjo. We had the 5th development plan. We had a rolling plan. We have the national policy directives. We had at some point Vision 2020. Then all the other efforts that were made, including Vision 2020, including National Transformation Agenda, and then after that, the ERGP. But all of these development plans have not delivered development for Nigeria. Or do you think that they have worked? And if you think that those development plans have worked, what is the guarantee that this one that is now being proposed on the back of what some people consider the failure of the ERGP will work? And how will it work? Or do you think, look, these development plans will never work? And if they will never work, what are the issues?
Let me start with the tail end of your question. Development plans can work. We may not have attained the level of success we envisioned in some of the development plans. But if you go back to the development plans of the under then General Yakubu Gowon, it was focused on infrastructure development. Virtually all the flyovers we have in Lagos, and there was emphasis was more in developing Lagos and some of the highways. If you look at some of the critical highways that we apply today, they were initiated by that development plan. The Benin Shagamu Express way, the Lagos Ibadan Express highway, some of those were envisioned and started under that development plan. All the major bridges in Lagos, the Apapa Badagry Express Road. So to some extent, Gowon lived his development plan. Then after Gowon, you remember Murtala Mohammed's tenure was short-lived, and then Obasanjo took over. And Obasanjo's development plan was centered around Operation Feed the Nation, if you remember very well. And it was more on the government providing supporting agriculture to grow. When Shagari came in as a civilian president, his emphasis was so much on green revolution, which is still an extension of Operation Feed the Nation. So the questions you have in terms of economic development plans are some elements of those plans did not work. What has happened is that subsequent to the Obasanjo government, and then we came back to Shagari's government that was also cut short by the military. We've now seen, one, in the first place, we saw a slowdown in development plans. And then subsequently, we saw that resuscitate under when Yar'Adua came with the Operation Vision 2020. And then we moved to Vision 2020. We started with Vision 2010 and Vision 2020, then to Vision 2020. But what is missing, like I said earlier, is in terms of implementation. Some of those plans are tall on ambition or dreams, or what I may call desirable destination, but short on strategy. A plan must have a destination in mind, must have a route to that destination, which is a strategy, must have measurable milestones, and then must have the tactics that have to be malleable, or that have to be adjustable based on the realities that you encounter in implementing that plan. Some of those plans we have mentioned, we are not that detailed, we're not that structured. So what happened was you had a plan, and then some other economic variables will crop up, and then the plan is abandoned, or there's a change in government. So it's not that the development plan cannot work. The worst thing we have is that we have no plan, because those who plan, who fail to plan to fail. It is better you have some plan like we have had, and then possibly you achieve one element of that plan. So it's not, in terms of the current plan, I think it is possible we'll achieve some of them, particularly if we do the heavy lifting. The heavy lifting has to come at the level of policy formulation that will make it attractive, because the focus is to bring in private capital into the economy. That will make it possible for private sector to come into the economy. Without the law that established NCC and created an environment to auction the telecommunications spectrum to the private sector, nobody would have come in. If you remember, we've tried before the auction of GSM in 2001. There were several efforts to bring in private sector to set up GSM in the country, which failed. But once the framework was properly developed, we brought in private capital. I think now that the government has realized that it can no longer afford to build the country from its budgetary allocations, we don't have the profile. And if we tried the 100 years, we will still be where we are today. Defining a plan that will bring a private sector to focus on those investments is the only way to go. And I think with that orientation, get the policy environment right, get the legal environment right, and then the government will do its own part. The government job will become, countries are running small government, the government job will become doable, let me put it that way. If the government create an economic environment where there is investment, there's job creation, there will be less insecurity in the country. And the government can focus on addressing social issues.
Right. You just cited the example of the private sector and telecommunications, but I want to take you to what the Minister of State, Clement Agba, Minister of State for Budget and Planning, said with regards to this plan, talking about Volume 1. It's going to be in 3 volumes. Volume 1 will be accessible to the public. There's Volume 2, which will be sort of fed into subsequent budgets, and then Volume 3, which deals with legislation and policies that can implement the proper implementation of the plan. What are those policies and legislations? What would you like to see to strengthen the capacity of the private sector beyond telecoms that you've mentioned already?
Okay, I think I'm happy you are speaking on that, because that's actually the Volume 3 is the most critical aspect of the 3 volumes. Because without Volume 3, the Volume 1 and 2 would become unimplementable. The Volume 3, which is the issue of the legal and regulatory framework, I'll just mention a few things as it relates to that. Let's take, for instance, the government wants to bring in private sector, because some of the critical areas we start, like I mentioned, we have to start with the most critical sector, which is infrastructure. Because without infrastructure, the other aspects you need investment will also be difficult to attract. So the government wants to bring in private sector to build the rail lines. Let's focus on transport infrastructure, for example. So you need to come up with one, a template, or what you may call a legal framework that will indicate if you invest in the rail sector, you will have a 20-year or 30-year concession. This concession is not cancelable. If you are building the rail tracks, you will own the right of way up to a certain distance from that point. And then any revenue, you can commercialize the right of way, which means you can grant access to for people to build hotels around the stations, the rail stations, so that people can actually have some points of rest. You can allow for adverts, so all the revenues along that route will belong to you. So you can do your figures and say, okay, if I build a standard gauge rail from Lagos to Aba, and I have to go through Onitsha, go through Benin, go through Asaba, then these are commercially viable areas. I will allow, give concessions to other people who can run the hotelier to build hotels around the stations, so that people who are coming to Asaba live in the night can sleep in Asaba, stuff like that, or those who are moving from Asaba to other areas. So that is defined. Then it will agree on what is the number of lines or tracks you're going to have, particularly in some areas. That will be determined. It will agree on how many years it will take you to build that infrastructure. You can actually go as far as saying, okay, this is the minimum number of employment you can create. And should the government want to cancel that, there will be provision, because I always emphasize that if you...
Okay, I mean, Yeah. So just finish up, because you were trying to talk about the regulatory.
I always say that if you want to create a concession for people to have public access to public goods, you must also make provision for in case of cancellation. So in case you cancel, you have to buy back on any revenue for a particular number of years that the concessionaire is entitled to. That way, the concessionaire will say, okay, if anything goes wrong, I'll get back my money, and I'm not going to be left with the short end of the stick. So that is a level of detail that the government has to develop a document that will allow private sector to now bid to get those concessions. Because once you have this, people can actually do their figures and say, look, it makes sense.
Okay. Thank you so much. I wanted to ask a question, but they said no more time. I will have, maybe when next we talk, I wanted to talk about the need for scenario planning in our national planning, which is a very important part we don't look at, but no more time. But thank you so much for your time, and Merry Christmas, sir.
Anyway, thank you. I Chief Johnson Chukwu, and I hope you are enjoying your Christmas vacation. Thank you for joining us.